On the morning of October 31st, 1955, a press statement was issued from Clarence House in London. It ran to barely 100 words. In it, a 25-year-old woman renounced the man she loved. She wrote that she was mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and of her duty to the Commonwealth. She had decided, she said, to put these considerations before any others. She signed it, Margaret. The man in question was Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero, equerry to her late father, 16 years her senior, and divorced. The romance had consumed the British press for nearly 3 years. Crowds had gathered outside palaces, cabinet ministers had been summoned, the Archbishop of Canterbury had been consulted. The young woman at the centre of it all had been photographed leaving church services, scrutinised at race meetings, debated in newspaper columns from Sydney to Toronto. And now, with 100 words, she had ended it. What the public did not know, and would not know for decades, was the full shape of what she had given up. They did not know about the financial conditions her sister's government had attached. They did not know about the lonely letters Townsend would carry to his grave. They did not know that this decision, made in the early winter of her adult life, would echo through every relationship that followed, through the marriage she would enter, the children she would raise, the lovers she would take, the parties she would host, the cigarettes she would chain smoke, the whiskey she would pour. This is the story of a woman born to the wrong throne, in the wrong decade, with the wrong temperament for the role history handed her. It is the story of a princess who tried, once, to choose her own life, and the price she paid, year by year, for what that choice cost and what it failed to deliver. To understand Princess Margaret, you must first understand the accident of her birth. She was born on August 21st, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York. At the moment of her arrival, no one expected she would become the sister of a queen. Her uncle, the dashing Prince of Wales, was the heir apparent. Her father was a stammering second son with a quiet wife, destined, it seemed, for a life of minor royal duties, ribbon cuttings, regimental dinners and country weekends. The household into which Margaret was born was warm by royal standards. Her parents adored each other and adored their daughters. There were nicknames, in-jokes, family games. Her elder sister, Elizabeth, 4 years her senior, was solemn, dutiful, fond of horses and order. Margaret was almost her opposite. From toddlerhood she was theatrical, musical, mischievous. She could mimic anyone in the household by the age of 5. She sang before she could properly speak. Her governess, Marion Crawford, would later write that the younger princess was an imp, charming and impossible in equal measure. Then, in December 1936, everything changed. Her uncle, now King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne to marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson. The crown passed to Margaret's father, who became King George VI. Her sister Elizabeth, at the age of 10, became heir presumptive, and Margaret, at 6, found herself in a peculiar new position. She was the spare, not the heir, not destined to rule, not, for that matter, destined for anything in particular, except to be near power without ever holding it. This distinction shaped her entire life. The two sisters were educated together by governesses, in the schoolroom at Buckingham Palace, and later at Windsor Castle during the war years. But Elizabeth received additional tutoring in constitutional history, in the workings of Parliament, in the responsibilities that awaited her. Margaret did not. The understanding, never quite spoken aloud, was that the younger daughter would marry well, behave decoratively, and produce no scandal. She would have all the privileges of royalty. and almost none of its purpose. She grew up beautiful in a particular and striking way. She was small, barely 5'2", with vivid blue eyes, a porcelain complexion, and a figure that the fashion photographers of the post-war years could not resist. She smoked through long ebony cigarette holders. She wore Dior. She loved jazz and theatre and the bohemian London of the late 1940s, the city of dim nightclubs and bright young things rebuilding themselves after the bombing. She was also, by every account, formidably intelligent. She read constantly. She played the piano well enough that professionals took her seriously. She had a memory for verse that astonished her father, who would sometimes ask her to recite at family gatherings. She spoke French with a Parisian accent. She could be devastating in conversation, witty and acid and quick, and she did not always know when to stop. The death of her father in February 1952 ended whatever stability her young adulthood had possessed. King George VI had been, by all accounts, the centre of her emotional world. His death, when she was 21, was a wound she would describe decades later as the moment her life truly changed. Her sister became queen. Her mother became the Queen Mother and moved to Clarence House, taking Margaret with her. Margaret herself became something more difficult to name. She was the Queen's sister, a position with enormous visibility and no defined function. Into this vacuum walked Peter Townsend. He had been her father's equerry, a Battle of Britain pilot with a chest full of medals and the kind of quiet, watchful manner that royal households tend to require. He was 37 when the king died, married with 2 sons, and had served the royal family with such discretion that the late king had developed a real affection for him. He stayed on in the new household, attached now to the Queen Mother and to Princess Margaret. The setting for what followed was claustrophobic in the way only royal households can be. Margaret was unmarried, restless, grieving. Townsend was unhappily married, his wife having begun an affair of her own. The two of them rode together in the mornings. They sat together at dinners. They worked in adjacent offices. Whatever began between them began slowly, the way these things do, and by the time either of them recognized it, it was already past the point where retreat was easy. Townsend would later write that he could not say exactly when he had fallen in love with the princess, only that he had, and that she had told him she felt the same. The first public sign of the romance came at the coronation in June 1953. Margaret was photographed brushing a piece of fluff from Townsend's lapel. The gesture was small, almost domestic, and entirely unmistakable. Within 48 hours, foreign newspapers had identified what British editors had so far declined to print. The American press ran the story. The European press ran the story. The British press, holding to the deferential conventions of the period, hesitated for several more days before breaking ranks. The People newspaper finally published a story on June 14th, framed as a denial of rumours circulating abroad. The denial was the publication. Britain learned in that moment that its new Queen's sister was in love with a divorced commoner. The reaction was immediate and severe. The Queen's private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, reportedly told Townsend that he must be either mad or bad. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was consulted. The Archbishop of Canterbury was alerted. Within weeks, Townsend was removed from the royal household and posted as heir attaché to Brussels. The intention was to separate the couple for 2 years, until Margaret reached the age of 25, at which point she would no longer require the Queen's consent under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. The witnesses to this expulsion were many, and most of them later wrote about it. The reaction from Margaret herself was, according to those close to her, a kind of stunned compliance. She had not expected to be told no. She had grown up believing that her family loved her enough to want her happiness. The revelation, slow and bitter, was that institutional considerations would always outweigh personal ones. Townsend left for Brussels. Margaret went on a tour of southern Rhodesia. They wrote letters. The 2 years passed. In August 1955, Margaret turned 25. Townsend returned to London in October. The press encampments outside Clarence House grew enormous. Photographers slept in their cars. Reporters from 20 countries waited at the gates. The couple met in private at the country house of friends, including Allenbay Park in Berkshire, where they spent a weekend under the eyes of fellow guests who later described an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension. The Eden government convened. The cabinet discussed terms. The terms were severe. Anthony Eden, himself divorced and remarried, presented the princess with what amounted to an ultimatum. If she married Townsend, she would have to renounce her right of succession. She would lose her civil list income. She would likely be required to live abroad for a period of years. The Church of England, of which her sister was supreme governor, would not bless the marriage. She would, in effect, cease to be a working member of the royal family. The setting in which Margaret made her decision was the home of her cousin, Lord Rupert Neville, at Uckfield in Sussex. She spent a long weekend there in late October 1955. Townsend was present. They talked. They walked in the gardens. The witnesses were few, mostly the Nevilles themselves, and they were discreet. What is known is that on the evening of October 24th, Margaret returned to London and informed the Queen that she had decided not to marry Townsend. The statement was drafted with the help of Townsend himself, in an extraordinary act of mutual composition. He had begun writing it weeks earlier, anticipating the outcome. The revelation, which would only emerge in later memoirs, was that Townsend had been the one who finally said it could not be done. He had looked at the conditions and judged, perhaps correctly, that the life on offer would destroy them both. 2.5 years later, Margaret met Anthony Armstrong Jones at a dinner party. The setting was the home of Lady Elizabeth Cavendish in February 1958. Armstrong Jones was a society photographer, 27, the son of a barrister and the nephew of the theatre designer Oliver Messel. He was small, slight, exquisitely dressed, and possessed of the kind of restless charisma that the Chelsea set of the late 50s prized above almost any other quality. He was also bisexual, though this was not widely known at the time, and was conducting at least 2 simultaneous relationships when he met the princess. The witnesses at that first dinner later recalled that Margaret and Armstrong Jones spoke to each other almost exclusively, ignoring the rest of the table. The reaction among their mutual friends was a mixture of amusement and unease. The revelation, slower to arrive, was that Margaret had found in him precisely what she had been told she could not have. He was a commoner. He was an artist. He was alive in a way that the guards officers and minor aristocrats of her usual circle were not. Their engagement was announced in February 1960, just months after the death of Townsend's hopes of any reconciliation, and indeed only weeks after Townsend himself had become engaged to a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Jamagne, who, the press noted at once, bore a striking physical resemblance to Margaret. The setting was Buckingham Palace. The Queen made the announcement. The reaction was largely positive. Armstrong-Jones was photogenic, charming, untainted by divorce. The witnesses to the engagement included Margaret's mother, who was said to have approved. The revelation, hidden from public view, was that Margaret had accepted Armstrong-Jones's proposal on the day she received word of Townsend's engagement to the Belgian woman. The two facts, never publicly linked at the time, sat side by side in her private correspondence. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey on May 6, 1960. It was the first royal wedding to be televised. An audience of around 300 million people watched around the world. The setting was magnificent. The dress designed by Norman Hartnell, the carriage procession glittering. The event was followed by a 6-week honeymoon aboard the royal yacht Britannia in the Caribbean. The witnesses, members of the crew and staff, would later report that the atmosphere on board had been strained almost from the first day. The new husband had brought reading material and worked through it with grim determination. The princess had spent long hours alone on deck. The reaction of those who saw them disembark in the Bahamas was that something had already gone wrong. The revelation, in the words of one biographer, who interviewed several of the witnesses decades later, was that the marriage had failed before it had properly begun. The early years of the marriage produced 2 children. David, Viscount Linley, was born in November 1961. Sarah Armstrong-Jones followed in May 1964. The couple were given an apartment in Kensington Palace, the spectacular apartment 1A, which Armstrong-Jones, now created Earl of Snowdon, redesigned with characteristic flair. The setting was glamorous. The couple hosted dinner parties attended by the cream of London society. Peter Sellers came, Mick Jagger came, the Rolling Stones came, Cecil Beaton came. The Snowdons, as they were now known, became the centre of a particular kind of 1960s celebrity, photographed everywhere, written about constantly. The reaction in the press was generally adoring. The revelation, accumulating in private, was that both of them were profoundly unhappy. The pattern of their estrangement was documented later by friends, staff, and eventually both parties. Snowdon began conducting affairs almost openly. He left notes for Margaret, cataloguing her faults. He once placed a list titled 20 Reasons Why I Hate You between the pages of a book where he knew she would find it. The setting for these cruelties was the same apartment in which they hosted London's most desirable parties. The witnesses included household staff who would later, in old age, share their accounts with biographers. The reaction of Margaret was complicated. She defended her husband publicly. She drank more. She smoked more. She began her own affairs. The revelation, when it came, was that the marriage had become a kind of slow mutual destruction, conducted under the brightest possible spotlights. In 1973, Margaret met Roddy Llewellyn at a house party in Scotland. The setting was the home of Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, who would prove the most consequential friendship of her later life. Tennant had bought the Caribbean island of Mustique in 1958 and had given Margaret a plot of land there as a wedding present. He now introduced her, with characteristic mischief, to a 25-year-old aspiring landscape gardener of fragile temperament and considerable charm. Llewellyn was 17 years younger than the princess. The witnesses at that first meeting later recalled that he had spent much of the weekend in tears, having recently broken up with another lover. The reaction of Margaret was first maternal, then something else. The revelation, when the relationship became public 3 years later, was that the princess of 43 had taken a lover of 28, and that the British public, despite changing mores, was not yet ready to forgive her for it. A photograph taken on Mustique in February 1976, showing Margaret and Llewellyn together in swimsuits, ended what remained of her marriage. The setting was Tennant's Beach. The image was sold to the News of the World. The publication was immediate and devastating. Snowden, who had been conducting his own affairs for years, seized upon his wife's exposure as the pretext he had been waiting for. The witnesses to the marriage's collapse included the Queen, who summoned both parties separately and listened. The reaction was a formal announcement of separation in March 1976. The revelation, painful and lasting, was that Margaret had become the first senior royal to divorce since Henry VIII. The divorce was finalized in 1978. She was the first divorced member of the royal family in the 20th century. The reaction in the press was savage in a way that even the Townsend coverage had not been. She was depicted as profligate, lazy, drunken, immoral. The fact that her husband had been conducting affairs throughout the marriage was largely set aside. The cultural moment was uncovered.